All right, I want to begin tonight with a deliberately provocative statement. You all in the audience, as residents of Knoxville, live in one of the most globally influential cities in America. Now, before you start laughing, let me explain. I'm not talking about Benton's Bacon or even Dolly Parton. I'm talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. And I'm going to argue tonight that East Tennessee, through the TVA, transformed literally millions of lives across the globe during the 20th century. What you might have thought was a local story was in fact a very global one. Now, first off, what was the TVA? It's a federal agency that's created in 1933 by President Franklin Roosevelt, with its headquarters here in Knoxville. And essentially, the TVA planned to construct 16 hydroelectric dams on the Tennessee River in 7 different states of the American South, as you can see from this following map. But the TVA was about much more than just dams or electricity. It was far more ambitious. It's really the first development project as we know it today. TVA planners looked at the US South in the 1930s the way that the World Bank looks at Nicaragua today. In the eyes of TVA planners, the Tennessee Valley was backward. It was in need of modernization. They hoped to transform the entire culture of the region, to expand its economy, to improve public health, and to restore worn-out soils like the ones you see here. Now, did the TVA accomplish these goals? Kind of. The agency did bring lots of new jobs, and many people benefited from cheap electricity. But this was hardly a silver bullet solution. Poverty lingered, and many of these dams ended up being environmental catastrophes in the long run. Now, you might be wondering, though, didn't this guy say that this is going to be a global story? Well, that's next. The TVA is going to make its entrance onto the global stage after 1945 in the context of the Cold War, that global, epic, ideological struggle between 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And in the Cold War, the main battleground is going to be the so-called Third World, shown here in blue, countries that were not allied with either the First or Second Worlds. And in the Third World, the 2 superpowers hope to demonstrate that their social and economic models were the most useful. Well, during the Cold War, the US is going to actively push the TVA as a primary model for developing countries. They would claim that the TVA had worked to uplift the American South, our own underdeveloped region, and that it should be replicated elsewhere. And believe it or not, the TVA generated incredible enthusiasm abroad. Hundreds of foreign leaders would visit the Tennessee Valley after World War II. Here, for example, is Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, visiting Norris Dam in 1951. Then there was India's prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who's shown here in Knoxville at TVA headquarters in 1949. And Nehru's admiration for the TVA gave birth to the Damodar Valley Corporation, the DVC, whose logo is shown here to the right, which was a massive undertaking in northeastern India. The TVA also turned up in unexpected places. In 1966, during the Vietnam War, President Lyndon Johnson unveiled plans for a TVA on the Mekong, which he believed would win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese. But perhaps the country that was most impacted by the TVA, the country that was most reshaped by the TVA, was Mexico. And I want to spend the rest of my time tonight on the case of Mexico. Since the 1930s, Mexican politicians had begun comparing their agrarian problems with those of the American South, thinking that they could learn from its transformation. Now, those comparisons came to a head in 1947, when Mexican President Miguel Alemán visited Tennessee. And here he is at Chickamauga Dam, just north of Chattanooga. And during his visit, Alemán proclaimed that the TVA, quote, "the TVA plan can be fully applied to Mexico." And that's exactly what he intended to do. As this Mexico City newspaper proclaimed, Alemán observed yesterday in Tennessee what he proposes to do in Mexico. And soon thereafter, Aleman unveiled plans for 2 different river valley commissions that targeted southern Mexico. One would be on the Papaloapan River on the Gulf of Mexico, and the other would be on the Balsas River on the Pacific. And in both of these valleys, President Aleman planned to build dams, irrigation canals, and new roads alongside a massive public health campaign. During the 1950s, the Mexican government poured an enormous amount of money into this project. Ultimately, though, local residents saw very few tangible benefits. Tens of thousands of people, predominantly indigenous groups, were uprooted when dam reservoirs flooded their land. The centerpiece of the project was the Miguel Aleman Dam, shown here in a recent photo. And planners had hoped that millennial transformations would accompany these dams, but they were largely wrong. By the 1970s, most Mexicans soured on the dam campaigns, and they were largely abandoned. So, to wrap up, I think that TVA's global history might need to force us to rethink this place that we live. I think many folks in the UT faculty came here to Knoxville thinking that this town was parochial or isolated, perhaps. I encourage you to rethink these stereotypes. But most importantly, I encourage you to take the time and drive 20 minutes north, like I did this summer with my 4-month-old daughter, up to see Norris Dam, the nearest and maybe most impressive of the TVA dams. And when you're gazing out on that concrete behemoth, I hope that you'll stop and ponder, as we certainly did, how the American South transformed the world. Thanks.